Hey guys, Neptunusequester here with another Dark Souls 3 commentary. Whenever I see a fellow uploader post a video in which he explains his way of playing the PvP portion of the game, inevitably there will be comments like, "Stop trying so hard, Souls games are not competitive fighting games, dude." Or, "If you want to participate in esports, you might want to look into Street Fighter." The other side of this debate, meaning players who take PvP in Souls games at least somewhat seriously, rarely if ever explain why they treat the PvP portion of an action role-playing game with a medieval fantasy setting as if it were a competitive fighting game, but rather just insist that this is the way they are playing the game, just deal with it and get good, scrub. My own commentary video with the title Playing to Win went in that direction heavily, yet it is rather obvious that competitive PvP is not something FromSoft really intends us to do. Only Dark Souls 2, with its arena as an actual competitive context of PvP, was an exception to that. There we had rank points and rewards like weapons, spells, and a phantom aura tied to amassing said rank points, with the threat of losing ranks and even some of the respective rewards like your aura if you were defeated too often. But now in Dark Souls 3, every trace of that development is missing, reinforcing the theory that Souls games aren't really intended to be played competitively at all. So why do people still insist on doing just that? Today I want to tackle this topic, although I have to say up front that I do not really intend to change anyone's mind on that matter. This not the least because I myself do not really take a clear stance in that affair. Admittedly, I try to play as optimally as I can, yet at the same time I don't really enjoy competitive PvP all that much, and whenever my tryhard friends invite me to participate in a tournament, I usually decline because I simply prefer invading or dueling in a casual context, albeit always with the clear goal of winning. Instead of trying to persuade anyone, I just want to explain why a number of people, many of them with an extensive background in competitive fighting games like Street Fighter, pick up Souls games and play them in a certain way that often arouses incomprehension at best and serious anger or worse in other people. I had the pleasure of getting to know and talk to some of those players in the past year or so, mostly due to my pokey YouTube channel, as well as the fact that I was very persistent in my strive to become better at Souls PvP, and I needed help with that since I have no competitive gaming background whatsoever myself. Before Dark Souls 1 came out on PC back in 2012, I was playing games like the Gothic or Elder Scrolls series, and originally never set out to become proficient in a PvP environment. And the answer to the question why some people like to play Souls games as if they were competitive fighting games is actually pretty simple and straightforward. Because A, it is possible to do so, although some conditions have to be fulfilled, and B, because it is damn fun. Let's talk about the fun factor first, since this is of course a quite central aspect of all this. If something is not fun, you wouldn't do it, right? And the thing is, as we probably all agree, Souls games are amazing games. They are truly and literally excellent in many aspects, both in terms of their single player portion, as well as in their absolutely unique way of handling their multiplayer parts like co-op and PvP. There's hardly any other game out there that manages to integrate human interaction as organically into the overall individual gameplay experience as Souls games do. This is something that attracts not only PvE and lore fans, but naturally also players who are drawn to anything competitive, i.e. player versus player gameplay. And it's not only the way Souls games initiate such player interactions, but the very nature of those interactions that is attractive to so many different types of players, including the serious competitors. All problems with latency and lag, as well as balancing issues aside, the controls of Souls games are as tight and crisp as some of the best fighting games are. And the free movement within a 3D environment is something that many fighting game fans probably have been dreaming about since forever. Yet games like Street Fighter, Tekken, or Mortal Kombat never really managed to provide such a gameplay in the past, and have all gone back to 2D almost in unison as far as I'm aware. And don't forget the fact that we're pretty much all nerds here. So the prospect of wearing some jazzy plate mail set and whacking our opposition with a nice steel longsword is rather cool as well, and a nice change to the usual martial arts kerfuffle or gunfight gameplay we see so often in dedicated PvP games. In theory, at least, the number of different armor and weapon types, as well as potential playstyles, create a depth in Souls games that is just not there in many other multiplayer games. So, to summarize, Souls games have a very cool multiplayer part that, just like the single player mode, controls very well and offers a ton of different and attractive options to play and defeat your opponent with. All this strung together into a rather fascinating package of setting and atmosphere. This results in a series of games that is very fun to play for a wide variety of people, coming from backgrounds which are at times extremely opposed to each other. It is ironic in a way that this broad appeal of the Souls games that manages to draw in so many different strokes of folks is also the cause for so much conflict and toxicity when it can also be viewed as something harmonizing and unifying. But as I said, there are of course factors that prevent Souls games from ever being considered actually competitive fighting games to a point where they maybe even could be considered for esport purposes. Namely, there are issues with latency and lag, which is an inherent feature of a peer-to-peer connection system that is without alternative in a multiplayer system like that of the Souls games, unfortunately. This can have an impact on matches to a degree where you simply have to forfeit the fight, because even the most skillful manual latency compensation cannot tame the effects of delayed hit registration and a display of position anymore. Of course, there are also severe balancing issues, leading to a situation where some setups are simply more viable than others, making the game more a rock, paper, scissors affair than one that is determined by pure skill. Just to make that clear, even the most hardcore fighting games face the same issue in principle, in that some characters are simply stronger than others, but the difference in weapon tiers in Souls games, for example, is incomparably higher than those between character tiers in most fighting games. This means that there is only so much outplay potential in Souls games in unfavorable matchups, and the outplay potential that was actually present in past Souls games, such as Dark Souls 1 and 2, was mostly down to the critical system like backstabs and parries, as well as some advanced techniques that relied on engine glitches rather than a better overall game balance. Then there is the issue of healing and buffing, which in that exact way is simply not present in most fighting games. And we haven't yet spoken about the fact that dodge moves like rolls with instantly activating iframes in combination with attack moves that usually have long startup and recovery times create a scenario where reactive play is rewarded and attacking first is often punished, which doesn't make for very exciting gameplay to watch when two very good players are going at it while being serious about winning. This brings us to my first point, in which I said that Souls games can be played as if they were competitive fighting games, but only under some conditions. When Scorbrand, for example, organized the last big tournament in Dark Souls 2, which he unsurprisingly won, he imposed a rule set on the participants that spanned several pages and that was laughed at by some. Others just shook their head at it angrily. Healing, buffing, and the use of health regenerating items were all forbidden, and some weapons like the best katanas in the game and basically all good shields were out too. It was of course an educated attempt to make the encounters as dependent on individual player skill as opposed to gear matchups as possible. People outside of the hardcore PvP community took that as a sign that Souls games are just a shit option for events like such a tourney. And you have to admit, they kinda do have a point. If you have to force such a metagame because the actual game does not offer acceptable circumstances for the intended purpose, why even bother taking it so seriously and try so hard anyway? As I explained above, there is a certain degree of wishful thinking at play here. Again, Souls games are rather fun, and so the fans of a more competitive way of playing games really want to make it happen, damn it! And let's be real here, imposing a metagame on Dark Souls is not exactly something new. The no healing in a 1v1 meta is just one example of how most of us impose rules that have no foundation in the actual game itself. But there is also a big misunderstanding here when people assume that the hardcore PvP scene in Souls games takes those games unconditionally seriously. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. If you talk to those players, they will gladly admit that you can't take those games too seriously for the reasons I enumerated here and more. They know their shit about the nature of competitive fighting games a lot better than the majority of us do, and thus they absolutely do see the difference between them and Souls games. If you tell them that Souls games are not Street Fighter, you can be certain that you don't tell them anything they don't already know a lot better than you do. But knowing that certain aspects of Souls games prevent them from being serious hardcore esport titles does not at all rule out any notion of taking the gameplay in and of itself seriously. As I argued in my last video about playing to win, any game is defined as an activity with win-lose conditions. And it should be obvious that in addition to having fun in some way or other, the default goal of every player participating in PvP is to defeat his opponent and thus win. And even though the skill ceiling in Souls games is a far cry from that of games like Street Fighter, where mastering just one character can take months, it is still the case that practicing some fundamentals like spacing, or advanced techniques like the crazy backstab meta of Dark Souls 1, as well as stuff like stance swaps and quick attacks in Dark Souls 2, gave those games depth and the player an opportunity to consistently outplay their opponent and win. In fact, it is a sign of appreciation and respect towards a game when you don't just play it casually and instead really dig into it and try to be the best player you can be within the confines of the game's design and rule set. And not only is that a sign of respect towards the game, but also towards your opposing player. That can of course be a matter of debate, but I always wonder why people take such offense when their opponent swaps to a better weapon mid-fight or goes into super reactive turtle mode. To me, it's the exact opposite. If my opponent, upon seeing my name, switches from an ultra great sword to a top tier weapon, I take that as a compliment, because he knows that there is no fucking around with me and he better tries his best if he wants to win. At the same time, someone swapping down to a shit tier weapon because he sees that I use one myself is almost an insult to me. Do you really think I need your pity? I can handle myself very well, thank you very much, and I'm always open for a challenge, since that is the only way of improving at any game or in life in general. And in that regard, it really is a shame, in my opinion, that, as Neptunusequester said in his newest video, so many players choose to just give up against the more competitive minds out there and rather rant against them on public forums with the common denominator argument of Souls games not being competitive anyway. It is really amusing to me how they often say it was boring to play against players who play very optimally with very optimal gear. This is amusing to me because saying you are bored by that is akin to attaching a smiley face to a hate mail. Just as an author of hate mail is not smiling, you are not bored by facing more competitive players. You are the opposite of bored. You are in fact very emotional. You are annoyed, angry, and frustrated, but you won't admit that. But as I said in my last video, complaining about those players will not change anything whatsoever. If people treated the more competitive crowd in Souls games as a challenge that gives you opportunity to improve yourself, the experience of every single one of you, as well as that of the community, would vastly improve as a whole. The fact that many people don't want to deal with that aspect of Souls PvP is probably because they have a rather concrete and limited view on what PvP in those games is and what it is not. And to them, any form of competitiveness within that context is absurd. But don't make the mistake of thinking that aspect of competitive play against the odds of a game not meant to provide that will go away anytime soon. Yes, many of the hardcore players of past Souls games like Fisto or Scorebrand have left Dark Souls 3 a long time ago because they don't enjoy it very much. But for every one of them leaving, another one is coming in to take their place. People will continue to play those games optimally, try to improve as best as they can, and take the possibilities the game provides to the absolute limit in order to win. Why? Because it is possible in Souls games, and it is damn fun. Thanks for having me, folks. Liftschwander out.